Amsterdam in the 17th century was a city of extraordinary contrasts, a place where gleaming wealth and dark secrets coexisted side by side. The canals shimmered in the sunlight, reflecting elegant merchant houses that rose like jewels along their banks, each one a testament to the city's thriving trade and global influence. Ships laden with spices, silks, and exotic goods docked at bustling quays, bringing unimaginable wealth to the merchant class. To the casual observer, it was a city of prosperity, charm, and promise. But beneath the polished exterior of Amsterdam's flourishing streets, a more sinister reality quietly unfolded. Within the walls of these grand houses, behind the ornate doors and polished furniture, simmered tensions, resentments, and a silent struggle for survival that would eventually erupt in acts of unspeakable revenge. The wealthy merchants of Amsterdam were not just figures of commerce. They were symbols of power and authority. They commanded immense influence over the city's economy, the flow of goods, and the lives of those who worked for them. Their homes were lavish, adorned with tapestries, paintings, and artifacts collected from far-off lands, showcasing both their wealth and their taste for grandeur. Every detail, from the carved wooden staircases to the intricate glass windows, whispered of status and privilege. Visitors would marvel at the beauty and elegance of these canal houses, unaware that the same walls often concealed desperation, humiliation, and anger. The contrast between appearance and reality was stark, a tension that would provide fertile ground for the dark stories that history would record. Life for the merchants was orderly and predictable, governed by schedules, accounts, and social obligations. They entertained, traded, and negotiated, often unaware of the fragile web of human lives operating quietly around them. Servants moved through their households like shadows, performing tasks both menial and essential. These were the individuals who prepared meals, polished silver, and maintained the pristine condition of each room. Yet their labor was often invisible, their names rarely spoken, and their sufferings largely ignored. The servants' world existed in parallel to the world of their masters, a hidden layer where the weight of long hours, physical exhaustion, and emotional abuse pressed down relentlessly. The relationship between master and servant was inherently unequal, and the imbalance of power was reinforced by both law and custom. Servants could be dismissed at a moment's notice, beaten for mistakes, and publicly humiliated without recourse. Many were young, uneducated, or orphaned, finding their only refuge in service. Their lives were constrained, their movements limited, and their ambitions suppressed. Yet within this oppression, a quiet intelligence and careful observation often developed. Servants learned the rhythms, routines, and weaknesses of their masters, noting the small cracks in their authority, the moments when pride or greed overshadowed caution. In the shadows of the canal houses, these observations could ferment over months or years into a potent mix of resentment and cunning. The psychological landscape of a servant in these grand households was one of constant tension. On one hand, there was fear of punishment, of exposure, of social disgrace. On the other hand, there was a simmering awareness of injustice, a recognition of the disparity between the comfort of the masters and the deprivation endured by those who served them. Some attempted to escape, seeking freedom in the bustling streets of Amsterdam, only to find themselves trapped by economic necessity or social expectation. Others internalized their anger, masking their emotions with obedience and servility, while privately cultivating plans that might one day balance the scales. It is within this psychological crucible that some of the city's most shocking acts of revenge were conceived. Amsterdam itself, though vibrant and prosperous, provided both opportunity and cover for clandestine violence. Its labyrinth of canals, narrow alleyways, and dense neighborhoods allowed servants to move unseen, to whisper among themselves, and to acquire forbidden knowledge. Herbs, spices, and chemicals from across the globe filled the markets, and some of these substances were dangerously toxic. For a clever servant with knowledge or guidance, the tools of lethal revenge were not beyond reach. The city's prosperity, which seemed so orderly and controlled, could ironically facilitate disorder and danger, turning domestic spaces into stages for hidden crime. Historical records hint at a pattern. In households where cruelty or neglect was most pronounced, where anger was stifled by social expectation, incidents of poisoning or sudden illness among masters and their families were reported. These events, often dismissed initially as mere misfortune, occasionally revealed the darker undercurrents of servant life. The gap between wealth and suffering, between the visible polish of a household and the invisible torment within, created an environment where revenge could incubate silently and strike without warning. The psychological complexity of these acts, mixing desperation, calculation, and daring, adds layers of intrigue to the narrative. By exploring these hidden shadows, we begin to understand that Amsterdam's canals were not merely waterways for trade, but symbols of the duality of human life: beauty and danger, control and rebellion, light and darkness. The city itself becomes a character, reflecting both the brilliance of human achievement and the capacity for subtle cruelty. In the following sections, we will trace the lives of those who, invisible and oppressed, turned to the most secretive and deadly means of restoring balance in a world that had treated them as expendable. In the opulence of the canal houses, life appeared orderly and serene, yet the smallest acts of defiance could unleash consequences far beyond what the masters ever imagined. Behind every polished table, behind every glimmering candle, and within every neatly folded linen, there existed the potential for a quiet, calculated rebellion. The tension between outward harmony and hidden turmoil is the lens through which we will examine this dark chapter of Amsterdam's history. Here, in the spaces where servants labored and masters reveled, the seeds of revenge were sown. The city's beauty was inseparable from its danger, its light inseparable from its shadows, and its history inseparable from the hidden stories of those who dared to fight back in silence. The lives of domestic servants in 17th-century Amsterdam were a study in quiet endurance, a continuous negotiation between survival and despair. While the city outside bustled with merchants, traders, and wealthy families attending to business and social obligations, the servants moved through the shadows, largely unseen and unacknowledged. Their work was both exhaustive and exacting, scrubbing floors until they shone, preparing elaborate meals with precision, tending to the children of their masters, and maintaining the appearance of perfection in homes that radiated wealth. Despite the physical demands, it was the emotional labor, constant vigilance, forced politeness, and the suppression of anger or grief that weighed heaviest. Every servant understood that a single misstep could provoke punishment or humiliation, yet they carried on, masking exhaustion behind dutiful smiles and quiet compliance. Many servants were drawn from the poorest segments of society: orphan children, the destitute, or those fleeing harsh conditions in rural towns. For them, service was not a choice, but a necessity, a contract with survival itself. Their days began before sunrise and often extended long past twilight, structured around the unpredictable whims of their masters. There were few breaks, little opportunity for personal expression, and almost no recognition of their humanity. Their lives, though critical to the functioning of the wealthy households, were defined by invisibility and subordination. Yet, within this invisibility lay a hidden power, knowledge of routines, secrets, and vulnerabilities that could be leveraged if courage or desperation demanded it. The emotional and psychological toll of such servitude was profound. Servants witnessed excess and cruelty side by side, learning that wealth could breed both generosity and profound moral corruption. They were often the recipients of harsh discipline for minor errors: a poorly polished silver candlestick, a slightly overcooked meal, or a mismanaged room could provoke lashings or verbal abuse. In households where masters were particularly authoritarian or capricious, the threat of punishment hovered constantly, creating an environment of fear and submission. This psychological strain, combined with the isolation inherent to domestic service, forced many servants to internalize their anger, their shame, and their yearning for justice. These suppressed emotions became seeds for darker impulses, quietly growing beneath the surface. Despite the oppressive environment, servants developed a remarkable awareness of the inner workings of their households. They memorized the habits of their masters: when they dined, what they ate, who visited, and which rooms were used most frequently. They observed conflicts between family members, noting arguments or vulnerabilities that might later be exploited. Some even kept mental records of conversations, betrayals, and injustices, cataloging them as evidence of a world in which they were powerless. This knowledge, when combined with the tools at their disposal, access to kitchens, food, and household chemicals, created opportunities for subtle, calculated forms of resistance. The line between survival and rebellion could blur, and in the shadows of Amsterdam's canal houses, small acts of defiance sometimes escalated into devastating consequences. Accounts from contemporary records, court proceedings, and diaries reveal glimpses into the lives of these invisible figures. One servant described being forced to scrub the floors with harsh abrasives while the master dined and entertained guests, all the while enduring ridicule and verbal attacks. Another recounted long hours spent in candlelit kitchens, preparing meals while feeling the weight of silent resentment simmering alongside the sauces and broths. Such anecdotes illustrate the duality of their existence. Outward obedience masking inward turmoil, mundane tasks intertwined with a constant awareness of injustice. The monotony of labor was punctuated by small humiliations, each one eroding dignity and building an inner tension that would sometimes erupt in extraordinary ways. Social dynamics within the servant class also contributed to the environment of tension and secrecy. Servants often relied on one another for companionship and shared intelligence, exchanging observations about the habits of masters or discussing grievances in hushed tones. These interactions could serve as both emotional support and a means of plotting subtle resistance. Yet they were fraught with risk. Betrayal could lead to punishment, and rumors could travel swiftly, reaching ears that demanded loyalty to the household above all else. Trust was fragile, alliances temporary, and the servant's world was a delicate balancing act between cooperation, secrecy, and self-preservation. The contrast between the visible lives of masters and the hidden existence of servants was stark. While merchants and their families entertained, traded, and pursued social prestige, their servants endured the relentless grind of labor, often under threat of punishment or social scorn. Yet the servants' invisibility also provided them with opportunities for observation, strategy, and, ultimately, revenge. Many of the most shocking acts in Amsterdam's history, poisonings, sabotage, and calculated harm, originated not from open rebellion but from careful planning, executed in secret by those whose labor and loyalty were taken for granted. The very conditions of servitude, long hours, emotional suppression, access to domestic tools, created the circumstances for such clandestine acts. In examining these lives, one begins to see the intricate web of fear, resentment, and suppressed intelligence that existed behind the walls of Amsterdam's grand houses. The servants' experiences were not merely about labor or survival. They were also about negotiation, observation, and psychological endurance. The pressure of invisibility, combined with the awareness of injustice, created a tension that would eventually erupt into moments of shocking retribution. Within the kitchens, bedrooms, and corridors, ordinary objects, the ladle, the sugar bowl, the spice jar, became potential instruments of vengeance. The line between domestic routine and deadly strategy was thin, and the lives of these invisible individuals were quietly, dangerously intertwined with the fates of their masters. As we move deeper into the story, the seeds of rebellion planted in the daily struggles of servants will begin to sprout. The anger, the humiliation, and the meticulous observation of those who lived unseen will manifest in cunning plans and shocking acts of poisonings. Understanding the invisible lives of these individuals is essential to grasping the full scope of Amsterdam's hidden darkness, revealing not just crimes, but the human stories and psychological complexities that made such acts possible. It is here, in these overlooked corridors and candlelit kitchens, that the true drama of revenge quietly, methodically, and inevitably unfolds. In the shadowed kitchens and hidden pantries of Amsterdam's grand canal houses, an invisible danger took root, a danger that was measured not in swords or daggers, but in subtle powders, bitter herbs, and carefully crafted concoctions. Poison, once a whispered tool of the elite, became a secret weapon for those without status, a means for the invisible to assert control over the powerful. In a society where servants were constrained by law, morality, and social expectation, the ability to end a master's life without raising suspicion offered a rare and terrifying empowerment. What appears, at first glance, as a simple meal, a cup of tea, or a sprinkle of spice could, in the hands of the right individual, carry a death sentence. The very kitchens that sustained life could also be the stage for meticulously orchestrated revenge. The knowledge required to administer poison successfully was not widespread, yet servants who observed, experimented, or learned from illicit sources could transform mundane substances into instruments of death. Herbs like wolfsbane, nightshade, and hemlock, easily disguised in sauces or stews, could slowly weaken a victim, producing symptoms that appeared natural or coincidental. Sugar, commonly used in the wealthy households, could be laced with powdered arsenic, while certain spices could mask the taste of bitter, deadly additions. In the context of 17th century Amsterdam, where illness was common and medical understanding limited, these acts could go undetected for weeks, allowing a servant to move freely while the master grew increasingly weak, confused, or feverish. Each carefully calculated dose was both a gamble and a statement, a silent protest against a lifetime of oppression. Historical records tell us that some servants displayed extraordinary cunning and patience. One account describes a maid who, over the course of several months, gradually poisoned her master, carefully monitoring his reactions and adjusting her methods to avoid suspicion. Another servant allegedly slipped small amounts of toxic powders into the morning coffee of a particularly cruel housekeeper, timing each administration so precisely that illness always seemed to arrive when attention was diverted elsewhere. These acts were not random. They were carefully strategized, often informed by intimate knowledge of the victim's habits, preferences, and weaknesses. The patience and audacity required to execute such schemes highlight both the desperation and ingenuity of those whose lives were otherwise tightly constrained. The psychological dimensions of poisoning cannot be understated. For the servants, each act was a complex interplay of fear, revenge, and self-preservation. The servant had to mask anxiety, feign routine, and maintain outward compliance even as deadly intentions simmered beneath the surface. Every meal prepared became a calculated decision. A pinch too much, and suspicion might arise. A pinch too little, and the plan might fail. Yet beyond mere pragmatism, there was often a profound satisfaction in asserting power where none had existed before. The act of poisoning transformed invisibility into influence, turning a previously helpless figure into one who could manipulate life and death itself. This moral ambiguity, where survival, resentment, and justice intertwined, underscores the dark fascination of these historical events. Amsterdam itself, with its labyrinthine streets, markets, and trade networks, facilitated access to deadly substances. Exotic spices, rare herbs, and unfamiliar powders arrived from distant continents, often without scrutiny, and some of these ingredients could be repurposed for clandestine ends. Servants who had spent years observing, cooking, and experimenting could learn to mix, measure, and conceal these materials with deadly precision. The city's wealth, which seemed to provide protection and abundance to the elite, paradoxically offered the very tools that could undo them. Within the polished walls of merchant homes, the line between nourishment and danger was razor thin, and a single careless bite could mark the end of a life. The stakes were higher still because discovery meant more than punishment. It meant death for the perpetrator. Amsterdam's legal system in the 17th century was strict, often brutal, and public executions were not uncommon. A servant caught in the act of poisoning faced hanging, torture, or permanent exile. Yet the risk did not deter many. The combination of desperation, long-term abuse, and the perceived righteousness of revenge drove them to take calculated chances, relying on secrecy, timing, and subtlety to evade detection. The knowledge that one could be both invisible and dangerously effective created a tension that permeated every gesture, every meal prepared, and every interaction with a master. Specific cases illuminate the audacity and horror of these acts. Court records recount a young woman who poisoned not one, but multiple members of a household over several months, motivated by a combination of revenge and fear. Her strategy involved careful observation of family routines, the use of common kitchen ingredients as vehicles for toxins, and the patience to strike only when suspicion would be minimal. In another instance, a servant employed the aid of an accomplice to deliver fatal doses under the guise of daily chores, a testament to both coordination and cunning. Each story reveals the meticulous planning required, the moral and psychological gymnastics involved, and the eerie quiet in which deadly intentions were executed within spaces that appeared harmless and routine. It is also worth noting the broader social dynamics at play. The servants were not merely acting as individuals. Their actions reflected, in part, a rebellion against systemic injustice. By striking at the powerful through covert means, they challenged the social order without overt confrontation, asserting agency in a world where direct defiance could be fatal. Poisoning, in this sense, becomes more than a criminal act. It becomes a statement, a dark echo of human frustration and the desire for balance in a world heavily tilted against them. The domestic sphere, seemingly trivial to the outside world, became a battleground for justice, vengeance, and survival. As we explore these chilling acts, it is essential to understand the tension between meticulous planning and moral ambiguity. The servants who wielded poison did so with precision and care, yet they also navigated fear, ethical conflict, and the constant threat of discovery. Each meal served, each powder measured, and each observation made contributed to a story of desperation, ingenuity, and the human capacity for both ingenuity and cruelty. The kitchens of Amsterdam's canal houses were more than places of food preparation. They were arenas where invisible actors quietly shaped destinies, where the sweet taste of daily sustenance could hide a deadly bite, and where revenge simmered quietly beneath the surface. The quiet menace that had simmered in Amsterdam's canal houses could not remain hidden forever. For months, perhaps years, servants had moved in silence, blending obedience with deadly intent. Yet inevitably, the fragile balance between secrecy and discovery was broken. Illnesses that had once seemed coincidental grew suspicious. Masters weakened inexplicably, household routines disrupted by sudden deaths or prolonged fevers. Rumors began to circulate among merchants and neighbors, whispers that a shadow had infiltrated the most trusted spaces of their homes. The reality, that those who were meant to serve could also destroy, shocked a city accustomed to order, wealth, and control. The process of uncovering these crimes often began in small, unremarkable ways. A servant might be caught sneaking a small bottle into a pantry, or a master might notice that certain foods caused repeated discomfort. Friends and relatives of the ailing merchants sometimes demanded explanations, prompting domestic inquiries. In some cases, loyal servants exposed their peers, either out of fear, guilt, or a desire to protect themselves. Each discovery was layered with tension, as suspicion grew but proof remained elusive. The city's elite found themselves vulnerable in a world they believed they controlled, realizing too late that danger had lurked quietly among those they had considered invisible. Amsterdam's judicial system, although thorough by contemporary standards, relied heavily on testimony, confession, and circumstantial evidence. Trials of accused servants became public spectacles, drawing crowds eager to witness both scandal and punishment. The courts meticulously documented each step: interrogations, witness statements, and confessions often extracted under duress. Servants accused of poisoning their masters faced relentless questioning, sometimes forced to recount minute details of their daily routines, meals prepared, and substances used. The fear and tension in these proceedings were palpable, not only for the accused but for the city itself, as every revelation confirmed the existence of a hidden, lethal danger within supposedly secure households. These trials revealed a level of cunning and patience that stunned contemporaries. Servants had not acted impulsively. Their crimes were methodical, calculated, and often extraordinarily patient. Some had poisoned their masters over extended periods, carefully observing symptoms and adjusting dosages to avoid suspicion. Others acted in moments of sudden opportunity, seizing the chance to strike when oversight was minimal. The courts were confronted with the chilling realization that those considered powerless were capable of planning and executing acts of lethal precision. Public fascination with these revelations only added to the tension, turning otherwise ordinary domestic servants into figures of both fear and intrigue. The emotional shock for families and neighbors was profound. Merchants who had prided themselves on meticulous management of their homes and workers found themselves blindsided by betrayal. The idea that someone so close, so ostensibly loyal, could harbor lethal intentions shattered notions of trust and security. The canal houses, once symbols of stability and refinement, were now scenes of paranoia and dread. Household members questioned each other, distrust replaced casual interactions, and everyday life became a constant exercise in vigilance. The city's social fabric was strained as whispers of poisoning spread through neighborhoods, casting suspicion on servants and visitors alike. Accounts from the period suggest that some servants confessed under intense pressure, revealing intricate networks of collaboration and concealed knowledge. These confessions exposed not only individual acts of revenge, but also a broader pattern of resentment simmering within domestic life. Servants described enduring years of mistreatment, humiliation, and exploitation, offering context to their otherwise shocking acts. While society condemned the murders, these revelations introduced a complex moral dimension. The killings were not random violence, but, in the eyes of the perpetrators, a response to sustained injustice. The public struggled to reconcile horror with the subtle recognition of human suffering and the desire for retribution. The fear of hidden poisonings extended beyond the immediate households to the city itself. Merchants began monitoring meals more closely, restricting access to kitchens, and questioning even trusted staff. Some resorted to hiring new, inexperienced servants under constant scrutiny, while others sought protective charms or consulted early medical practitioners in hopes of detecting toxins before harm could occur. The pervasive anxiety transformed daily life, turning simple domestic routines into exercises in suspicion and strategy. Even routine dining, once a symbol of comfort and social cohesion, became fraught with tension, with every bite carrying the potential for danger. Public reaction often veered between fascination and hysteria. Crowds gathered outside courthouses to witness the outcomes of trials, absorbing the dramatic confessions of those who had killed in secret. Stories of servants' patience, cunning, and audacity circulated widely, growing in both detail and exaggeration. Newspapers and pamphlets chronicled the most sensational cases, turning real acts of revenge into legends of calculated malevolence. Yet behind the spectacle lay genuine tragedy. The loss of life, the betrayal of trust, and the societal cracks exposed by these clandestine acts. Amsterdam, a city celebrated for its trade and sophistication, had been forced to confront a darker, hidden reality. Through these revelations, the contrast between visible wealth and invisible suffering became unmistakable. The grandeur of canal houses, the meticulous attention to appearances, and the social dominance of merchants were now shadowed by the reality that even the most privileged could fall victim to those they had oppressed. Servants, once unseen and underestimated, had proven capable of turning their intimate knowledge of household routines into instruments of mortality. The discovery of these crimes shattered assumptions, rewriting the narrative of power, vulnerability, and human cunning in Amsterdam. As the courts concluded, punishments were meted out in accordance with contemporary law, hangings, public shaming, and imprisonment, but the city was left with a lingering unease. The events revealed not only the capacity for hidden violence, but also the consequences of systemic neglect and abuse. For every servant punished, countless others returned to service, carrying within them the potential for continued resistance, observation, and, in some cases, revenge. The revelations transformed Amsterdam, exposing the invisible struggles behind the canal houses and illustrating that darkness, once incubated, could erupt with devastating and unforeseen consequences. Behind every calculated act of poisoning in Amsterdam lay a complex web of emotion, oppression, and human psychology. The servants who resorted to such measures were not merely criminals. They were individuals shaped by prolonged abuse, humiliation, and a lifetime of invisibility. Each act of revenge was steeped in a mixture of fear, cunning, and a desire for justice as they perceived it. Unlike impulsive outbursts of violence, these poisonings required foresight, patience, and intimate knowledge of the victim's routines. The psychological tension inherent in maintaining outward obedience while nurturing secret deadly intentions created an extraordinary mental strain, shaping both the actions of the servants and the narratives that would later shock the city. To understand these crimes, one must first comprehend the emotional landscape of the household servant. Their days were filled with monotony and physical exhaustion, but the true weight lay in the invisible chains of social hierarchy. They were constantly reminded of their inferiority through harsh words, demeaning tasks, and systemic marginalization. The disparity between the comfort and privilege of the merchant class and the grueling labor of their servants was stark and impossible to ignore. This imbalance generated simmering resentment, a quiet rage that, when combined with opportunity and access to lethal substances, became a potent catalyst for revenge. The psychological drive to reclaim agency, even in the smallest way, was a recurring theme among those who chose to poison their masters. Fear played an equally important role. Servants operated under the constant threat of discovery, punishment, or execution. Every step toward revenge required careful calculation, and even minor mistakes could prove fatal. This heightened awareness of danger sharpened the mind, fostering cunning, observation, and strategic thinking. Servants had to anticipate the actions of their masters, predict responses, and adjust their tactics meticulously. In a perverse way, the constant danger made them hyper-aware and, paradoxically, empowered in the secrecy of their knowledge. Each act of poisoning was both a gamble and a psychological exercise in control, turning them from passive victims into active manipulators of life and death. Moral conflict was another layer of complexity. While anger and resentment fueled their actions, many servants grappled with guilt and fear of eternal consequences. They knew that what they were doing was legally and morally condemned, yet the years of abuse often provided justification in their own minds. The poisoning became a form of retribution, a balancing act against perceived injustices. This moral ambiguity creates a tension in the narrative. Viewers are invited to feel both horror at the crimes and empathy for the psychological torment and societal oppression that led to them. The servant's duality, obedient by day, vengeful by night, reflects the human capacity to navigate extreme circumstances with ingenuity and desperation. Social psychology also played a crucial role. Many of these acts were not solitary. Servants exchanged knowledge, observed one another, and sometimes collaborated. The hidden networks of information allowed them to refine their strategies, warn one another of potential dangers, and even encourage subtle acts of rebellion. In essence, these domestic underworlds functioned as small ecosystems of covert resistance, where observation, communication, and trust became tools of survival. The dynamics of these relationships added another psychological layer, balancing secrecy with collaboration, loyalty with self-interest, and cunning with caution. The complexity of these interactions highlights how revenge was rarely impulsive. It was a calculated product of social intelligence and learned strategy. The long-term planning inherent in these poisonings speaks to the remarkable patience and foresight of the servants. Some would administer tiny doses over weeks or months, monitoring the master's health and adapting to changing circumstances. This slow, deliberate approach required emotional discipline and constant vigilance, as well as a capacity to endure moral tension. The psychological impact of this long-term engagement with mortality cannot be overstated. The servants lived with the dual reality of normalcy and imminent danger, managing both their daily duties and their secret intentions. This constant cognitive load, balancing outward servitude with inner plotting, created an extraordinary psychological profile of individuals operating under extreme stress, yet capable of precision and calculation. Historical records and court documents illustrate the breadth of these psychological dynamics. Confessions and testimonies reveal servants' motivations, a lifetime of humiliation, repeated physical abuse, the denial of basic human dignity, and the relentless inequity of social hierarchy. Some confessed that their acts were planned in response to specific instances of cruelty, while others admitted to long-term resentment that eventually erupted in lethal action. The meticulous nature of the poisonings, combined with the psychological burden of secrecy, underscores the interplay between emotional pain, intellectual resourcefulness, and the human drive for revenge. Empathy and horror are tightly intertwined in these stories. On one level, the audience is confronted with the brutality of murder. On another, they witness the depth of oppression that led to such actions. This duality heightens the narrative tension, forcing viewers to reflect on questions of morality, justice, and human resilience. Were these acts purely criminal, or were they a form of desperate reclamation of agency in an unforgiving world? The ambiguity makes the psychological portrait of these servants all the more compelling, illustrating the fragility of human morality under extreme social pressures. The legacy of these acts of revenge extended beyond the immediate victims. Families were traumatized, neighborhoods became suspicious, and the social trust that held domestic life together eroded. Yet the poisonings also revealed the resilience, ingenuity, and adaptability of the human mind under oppression. The servants' ability to turn domestic spaces into arenas of strategy and resistance demonstrates the extraordinary psychological depth required to navigate a world defined by inequality, fear, and secrecy. In the end, the poisonings of Amsterdam are as much a story of human psychology as they are of crime. They reveal how desperation, intelligence, and moral conflict can converge to create actions that shock and fascinate centuries later. They are a testament to the ways in which those forced into invisibility can assert influence, shape outcomes, and leave a dark, indelible mark on history. The interplay between oppression and cunning, fear and courage, invisibility and deadly agency, forms the heart of this narrative, illustrating that human psychology in extreme circumstances is both terrifying and compelling. The poisonings of Amsterdam's canal houses left effects far beyond the immediate victims and perpetrators. Once the crimes were discovered and the trials concluded, the city's social fabric was forever altered. Households that had once operated on trust and routine now functioned under the shadow of fear. Masters scrutinized every action of their servants, no longer taking loyalty for granted. Meals were monitored, kitchens locked, and personal interactions weighed with suspicion. The subtle equilibrium that had once maintained domestic order had been shattered, replaced by a tense atmosphere in which every gesture could be interpreted as deceit or threat. The wealthy merchant class, previously confident in their dominance, now faced a profound insecurity. The realization that servants, who had long been considered expendable and invisible, possessed both knowledge and capability to exact lethal revenge was deeply unsettling. Many families altered their hiring practices, favoring new servants who lacked experience but could be strictly monitored. Long-term employees were no longer trusted, and suspicion seeped into every corner of household life. The ripple effect was psychological as much as practical, altering relationships, social norms, and the very sense of security within the city's elite homes. Beyond individual households, the city as a whole began to grapple with the consequences of these crimes. Word spread quickly, transforming individual acts of revenge into a collective anxiety. Neighbors shared rumors of poisoning, each story growing in magnitude and horror as it traveled through Amsterdam's tight-knit social networks. The public fascination with the poisonings mingled with fear, creating a tense environment in which ordinary interactions were scrutinized. Even casual servants' movements in the streets could trigger suspicion, and the previously invisible labor force became a source of both intrigue and dread. The city's identity, previously tied to commerce and prosperity, now bore a shadow of mistrust and uncertainty. The legal system also felt the long-term impact. Authorities recognized the need to tighten regulations within domestic spaces and to monitor potentially lethal substances more closely. Poison, once relatively accessible through kitchens and markets, became a subject of scrutiny and regulation. Punishments were not merely about retribution but intended to deter others from following in the footsteps of vengeful servants. Yet enforcement was uneven, and the knowledge that cunning and patience could circumvent oversight lingered in the public consciousness. This awareness perpetuated a sense of unease, a realization that human ingenuity in the pursuit of revenge could outpace societal structures and legal authority. These events also had a profound cultural impact. Writers, chroniclers, and gossipers documented the poisonings in great detail, transforming them into cautionary tales and sensationalized stories for the broader populace. Pamphlets and newspapers recounted the meticulous planning, the cunning, and the shocking audacity of servants who had turned everyday objects into instruments of death. The narrative of the invisible striking back against the powerful captured the imagination, blending horror with fascination. Over time, these stories became part of Amsterdam's collective memory, reinforcing the idea that even the most secure households could harbor hidden dangers. The ripple effect extended into the emotional lives of the city's elite. Merchants and their families became hyper-aware of potential threats, both domestic and social. Paranoia replaced complacency, with trust becoming a luxury few could afford. Some households adopted rigid hierarchies and stricter oversight, attempting to reclaim control through surveillance and discipline. Others, however, responded with fear and indecision, unsure how to navigate a world where even those closest to them might harbor lethal intentions. The psychological scars left by the poisonings were profound, shaping social interactions and domestic strategies for years to come. Interestingly, the ripple effects were not confined to fear and mistrust. The events sparked conversations about justice, morality, and the treatment of servants. While authorities condemned the poisonings as criminal acts, some chroniclers and observers acknowledged the underlying causes: prolonged abuse, humiliation, and social inequity. The servants' actions, horrifying as they were, forced society to confront uncomfortable truths about power dynamics and human behavior. These reflections did not immediately transform social norms, but they planted seeds of awareness that would influence perceptions of labor, authority, and moral responsibility in domestic life. Even after the trials concluded, the city remained attentive to subtle signs of unrest. Households instituted new rules, servants were monitored more closely, and meals were carefully prepared and inspected. Yet the knowledge that vengeful acts had already succeeded left an indelible mark. Families who had survived these events carried a mix of relief and lingering anxiety, knowing that the invisible threats could return. For the servants who remained, the poisonings became both a warning and a precedent. Acts of subtle rebellion could have catastrophic consequences, both for themselves and for the social order they inhabited. Ultimately, the poisonings reverberated through Amsterdam like ripples across the canals themselves. The immediate horror of the acts was compounded by long-term psychological, social, and cultural consequences. Trust, once taken for granted, had to be reconstructed painstakingly. Fear became intertwined with daily life, altering behavior, relationships, and domestic hierarchies. The city's reputation for order and prosperity was forever tinged with the unsettling knowledge that the invisible could strike in silence, and that the human capacity for cunning, patience, and revenge was as potent as any external threat. Amsterdam had been changed, not only by the acts themselves, but by the awareness that darkness could thrive behind even the most elegant facades. The hidden poisonings of Amsterdam left a legacy that extended far beyond the immediate victims and perpetrators, casting a long shadow over the city's social, cultural, and historical memory. While the dramatic trials and public executions captured contemporary attention, the deeper resonance of these events lingered quietly, shaping perceptions of domestic life, power, and human nature for generations. The stories of servants who turned secrecy into lethal agency became emblematic of a broader truth: that oppression, however subtle or prolonged, can breed extraordinary resistance, and that the invisible often carries the capacity to reshape the visible world. The fascination with these acts did not end with the trials. Chroniclers, pamphleteers, and writers seized upon the poisonings as cautionary tales, blending fact with sensationalism to captivate readers. These accounts emphasized the audacity, patience, and cunning of the servants, often highlighting their intelligence and resourcefulness even as they condemned their deeds. Over time, the poisonings became part of Amsterdam's folklore, a reminder of the fragile boundary between social order and chaos, trust and betrayal. The canal houses, once symbols of wealth and prestige, now carried a hidden narrative of fear and human cunning, their polished walls a silent testament to the consequences of unchecked power. Historically, the poisonings offered insight into the intersection of social hierarchy, labor, and morality. The extreme imbalance between masters and servants created a pressure cooker environment in which even the most meticulous oversight could not prevent tragedy. Historians studying these events note that the acts were rarely impulsive. They were planned with patience and precision, reflecting both the servants' intelligence and the profound effects of prolonged abuse. Each story illuminates the human capacity to adapt, observe, and exploit opportunities, underscoring the ways in which social inequality can catalyze both creative and destructive outcomes. The servants' acts, horrifying as they were, reveal patterns of behavior that continue to intrigue scholars and storytellers alike. The psychological and moral dimensions of these poisonings also contributed to their enduring impact. Viewers and readers are simultaneously repelled and fascinated, compelled to understand the inner lives of those who committed such acts. The servants' experiences highlight the tension between empathy and horror, forcing audiences to grapple with questions of justice, morality, and human resilience. Were these servants villains, victims, or something in between? The ambiguity adds depth to the narrative, illustrating that history is rarely black and white. The legacy of these events, therefore, is not merely the crimes themselves, but the ethical and psychological conversations they continue to provoke. In the broader social context, the poisonings influenced how households operated for decades. Masters became more vigilant, kitchens more closely monitored, and the hiring of domestic staff approached with increased caution. The invisible threat of revenge, once realized, reshaped the balance of power within private homes. Trust, which had been assumed and largely unquestioned, now required verification and vigilance. This shift in domestic norms highlights how a few carefully executed acts of defiance can produce ripples far beyond their immediate consequences, fundamentally altering social practices and perceptions. The subtle but persistent impact of fear transformed the intimate spaces of daily life, leaving a lasting imprint on Amsterdam's elite households. The cultural legacy is equally significant. Amsterdam's poisonings contributed to the city's enduring fascination with dark, hidden histories, stories in which the powerless wield influence in unexpected and often terrifying ways. These narratives inspired not only historical accounts but also fictionalized retellings, feeding a popular imagination attuned to mystery, suspense, and moral complexity. Over time, the tales of vengeful servants became emblematic of a certain type of human story, one where hidden knowledge, patience, and intelligence intersect with oppression, creating dramatic and chilling outcomes. They remain relevant today, influencing media, literature, and popular true crime storytelling, where the appeal lies in uncovering the secrets that lurk beneath everyday life. Yet the legacy of these events is not solely one of fascination or caution. They also serve as a reminder of the human consequences of systemic oppression. Each act of poisoning was born from a context of sustained injustice, humiliation, and marginalization. While modern audiences may recoil at the methods, understanding the historical and social conditions that precipitated these acts provides a more nuanced perspective. The stories illustrate the potential for human ingenuity to be directed toward both survival and retribution when societal structures deny basic dignity and agency. They are a testament to resilience in the face of adversity and to the extreme measures that desperation can inspire. The shadow cast by these poisonings extends even into contemporary reflections on labor, power, and morality. They force us to confront uncomfortable questions. How much oppression can a human endure before seeking revenge? Where does moral responsibility lie in a system structured to disadvantage one group while empowering another? And perhaps most chillingly, how easily can ordinary tools of domestic life, spoons, spices, and powders, be transformed into instruments of mortality? By examining these questions, the legacy of Amsterdam's poisonings transcends time, remaining a powerful narrative of human complexity, both dark and extraordinary. In the end, the hidden poisonings of Amsterdam are remembered not only for the horror of the acts themselves, but for the lessons they impart about the fragility of social structures, the subtle power of the overlooked, and the enduring tension between oppression and resistance. The canal houses, which once gleamed as symbols of prosperity, now stand as silent witnesses to history's hidden shadows, their polished interiors concealing the stories of those who fought, in secret, to reclaim agency in a world that sought to render them invisible. The city itself, with all its wealth, beauty, and order, carries the memory of these events, a haunting reminder that human nature, in its complexity, can never be fully contained.